The small group is a subtype of a more general structural category, the collectivity. The collectivity is a specific instance of social organization and identifiable chunk of the social order. The criteria for the existence of a collectivity are twofold. 1. A delimited social structure, a bounded network of social relations, and 2. A normative order applicable to the participants linked by the relational network. A social group defined as two or more people with some degree of common identity who interact on a regular basis in patterned ways. 1. Distinguished from an aggregate, a number of people who, while being in the same place, have no sense of belonging. A example, Times Square on New Year's Eve. 2. Also distinguished from categories, a number of people with a common status and sense of identity, but who never interact. B. Primary and secondary groups. The distinction between primary and secondary groups is based on the nature of the relationship among members, the social structure, and the normative structure. In the primary group, relationships are characterized by a warm intimacy, with close personal ties linking members. Social relations tend to be diffuse, involving many of the interacting parties and marked by positive affect. Values emphasized include much importance placed on the group as an end in itself. Simply, the act of associating, of coming together, is positively valued by group members. Norms are relatively particularistic in that they are adjusted to make allowances for the particular characteristics of the individual members. In contrast, secondary group relations are more specific, being based on fewer characteristics of members. Affect is controlled and emotions tend to be neutral and detached. Members tend to view the group as primarily a means to some end rather than an end in itself. Norms are more likely to be universalistic in character, with few allowances being made for individual differences. Secondary groups include special interest collectivities such as bridge clubs and political parties. Most groups represent some combination of these characteristics and types. However, it is important to note that although a small group may be a primary group, a secondary group, or some combination of these, only a small group and never a large one can be a primary group. This points to the importance of size as a defining criterion of the small group. 1. Primary group defined as A. Interaction is both personal and lasting. B. Characterized by warm intimacy, close personal ties. Circa diffuse usually involves many activities. D. Values include much importance placed on the group as an end in itself. E. Norms are adjusted to make allowances for the particular characteristics of the individual members. F. Examples. Family is most important, also close friends. 2. Secondary group defined in opposition to primary group. A. Interaction is impersonal and transitory, short-term. B. Goal-oriented, usually involving few activities. Circa viewed as a means to an end. D. Norms are more likely to be universalistic, few allowances made for individual differences. E. Concepts of social exchange, important reciprocity. F. Examples. Co-workers, political organizations. Formal versus informal groups. Formal groups are groups in which the social positions and the relations among them can be defined independently of the characteristics of persons occupying the positions. By contrast, in the informal group it is impossible to distinguish between the characteristics of social positions and the characteristics of persons occupying them. Like the primary-secondary group distinction, formal-informal represents a continuum along which a given group may vary. Primary groups are more likely to have informal structures, and secondary groups are more likely to have formal structures. There are, however, important exceptions, e.g., the family. Task versus non-task groups. Task groups, also known as instrumental groups, are groups whose members can be said to be working toward some purpose apart from the goal of merely associating together. For expressive, or non-task groups, it is impossible to distinguish a goal other than that of interaction for its own sake. Other important group designations. Reference groups. A. Defined as a social group that serves as a point of reference for individuals in evaluating some characteristic of themselves. B. May be either primary or secondary. In-groups and out-groups. A. In-group defined as a social group with which people identify and toward which they feel a sense of loyalty. Examples: fraternities, football teams, etc. Identify by colors, symbols. B. Out-group defined as a social group with which people do not identify and toward which they feel a sense of competition or opposition. Circa sense of we and they. D. Sharpens social group boundaries. E. Results in ethnocentrism. Group size. A. Small groups of interest to Georg Simmel. 1. Dyads groups with 2 members. Less stable, since either can withdraw and destroy the group. Greatest intensity of social interaction of any social group. 2. Triads groups with 3 members. Also unstable coalitions always possible, 2 against 1. Advantage over dyad, third person can serve as mediator to the other 2. 3. Example. Family changes when child is born. Relationship between spouses can be strengthened through the child. Can be weakened because of competition. B.As group size increases arithmetically. Relationships number increases geometrically n1, 2. Group conformity members desire to conform to group norms. A. Solomon Asch. Imagine for a moment that you are taking a course in social psychology from Dr. Solomon Asch and that you have agreed to participate in an experiment. As you enter his lab, you see 7 chairs, 5 of them already filled by other students. You are given the 6th. Soon the 7th person arrives. Dr. Asch explains that he will show a large card with a vertical line on it. Then he will show another card with 3 vertical lines. All you have to do is tell him which of the 3 vertical lines is identical to the line on the first card. Dr. Asch then uncovers the first card with a single vertical line and the comparison card with the 3 lines. The correct answer is easy, for one of the lines is obviously too tall, another too short, and one exactly right. Each person, in order, states his or her answer aloud. The 6 before you all answer correctly, as you do when it is your turn. The second trial is just as easy, and you wonder if it is even worth your time being here. Then something unexpected happens on the third trial. Just as before, it is easy to tell which lines match. The first student, however, gives a wrong answer. The second gives the same incorrect answer. So do the third, the fourth and the 5th. By now you are wondering what is wrong. Then it is your turn, and you give what you know is the wrong answer. The 7th person also gives the same wrong answer. On the next trial, the same thing happens. You know their choice is wrong, yet the other 6 give what to you are obviously wrong answers. Why aren't they seeing things the same way you are? Sometimes they do, but in 12 trials they don't. Something is going seriously wrong. When the 18th card is finished, you feel relief. The experiment is over, and you are ready to bolt for the door. You see Dr. Asch walking over to you with a big smile on his face. He thanks you for participating in the experiment, and then explains that you were the only subject in the experiment. It was a setup, and the other 6 were all stooges. I paid them to give those answers, he says. Now you feel relief. Your eyes weren't playing tricks on you after all. What were the results? Asch, 1952, tested 50 people. About 1/3 gave in to the group about half the time and gave wrong answers. Another 40% also gave wrong answers, but not as many. And 25% stuck to their guns and always gave the right answer. The results are somewhat disturbing. In our land of individualism, the group is so powerful that most people gave answers that they knew did not match objective reality. Add to this that this was simply a group of strangers. How much more can we expect the group to force conformity when we are with friends, people we value highly and depend on for getting along in life? B. Stanley Milgram, Obedience to Authority. Let us define obedience as compliance with persons in authority. To what degree are people obedient? Do they continue to obey even in extreme situations, where they might seriously hurt others? Suppose you are taking a course with Dr. Stanley Milgram, 1963. You appear in the Dr. Milgram's laboratory to participate in a study on punishment and learning. A second student arrives, and you draw lot for the roles of teacher and learner. You are to be the teacher, and he the learner. You are extremely glad you are not to be the learner when you see the learner's chair. With its protruding electrodes, it resembles an electric chair. Indeed, it isn't much different from one. Dr. Milgram shows you the machine you will run. You see that one side of the control panel is marked, mild shock, 15 volts, the center reads, intense shock, 350 volts, and the far right side reads, danger, severe shock. As the teacher, you will read aloud a pair of words. Then you will repeat the first word, and the learner will reply with the second word. If the learner can't remember the word, you press this lever on the shock generator. The shock will serve as punishment, and we can then determine if punishment improves memory. Every time the learner makes an error, increase the punishment by 15 volts. Then seeing the look on your face, Dr. Milgram says, the shocks can be extremely painful, but they won't cause any permanent tissue damage. I want you to see. You then follow him to the electric chair, and Dr. Milgram gives you a shock of 45 volts. There, that wasn't too bad, was it? No, you mumble. Then the experiment begins. You hope the learners sake that he or she is bright, but unfortunately they turn out to be rather dull. They get some of the answers right, but you have to keep turning up the dial. Each turn of the dial makes you more and more uncomfortable. When the learner received the first shocks, they let out some moans and groans, but at this point they are screaming in agony. They even protest that they suffer from a heart condition. How far do you continue to turn the dial? That, of course, was the purpose of the experiment. At what point do people refuse to participate? By now, you can guess that there was no electricity attached to the electrodes. All that was a fake. The learner was a stooge, pretending to be hurt. Milgram was motivated to do this research because the slaughter of so many Jews, Gypsies, and others designated by the Nazis as inferior required the cooperation of good people. Such behavior on the part of millions of ordinary people, doing nothing to stop the deaths, seemed bizarre, and Milgram wanted to see how ordinary, intelligent Americans might react to a similar situation. Milgram was upset at what he found. Many teachers broke into a sweat and protested to the experimenter that this was inhuman and should be stopped. The experimenter, however, calmly replied that the experiment must go on. Although the teachers were free to leave, the assurance from the authority, the scientist in the white coat in a university laboratory, that the experiment must go on was enough for most to continue. Milgram did 18 of these experiments, using many students in each. He used both males and females, put some teachers and learners in the same room where the teacher could see the suffering, and had some learners not give verbal feedback, only pound and kick the wall during the first shocks and then go silent. The highest proportion of teachers who pushed the lever all the way to 450 volts, 65%, occurred when there was no verbal feedback from the learner. Of those who could turn and look at the learner, 40% turned the lever all the way. But, like some of Ash's results, only 5% did the severe shocking when the stooge teacher refused to comply. Milgram's experiment raised a ruckus in the scientific community. Not only were social researchers surprised and disturbed at the results, but they were also alarmed at Milgram's methods. Milgram's experiments became the basis for rethinking research ethics. Irving Janis groupthink. Among the disturbing implications of the Ash and Milgram experiments is what is called groupthink, a strong concurrence-seeking tendency that interferes with effective decision-making. 1.at The core is the tendency for group members to strive for solidarity and cohesiveness to such an extent that they carefully avoid any questions or topics that could lead to disputes. 2. The suggestion of alternatives becomes a sign of disloyalty, for there is only one correct answer. 3. Groupthink is especially dangerous when it characterizes government officials. The options narrow, finally disappear, and the officials go hell-bent on a single course, unable to see anything beyond what they have already decided on. 4. If you criticize, it may mark you as not being a team player. 5. Examples. Roosevelt and his staff refused to believe Japan would attack Pearl Harbor. Kennedy's invasion of Cuba, Bay of Pigs. Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon in Vietnam War. Nixon and Watergate. Reagan and the Iran-Contra scandal. Group dynamics. 1. Group leadership. A. Groups vary in extent of leadership designation. B. Variety of ways of selecting leaders. 1. Cultural patterns. Family leadership. 2. Gradual emergence. Friendship groups. 3. Election. Larger secondary groups. Circa. Typically 2 types of leadership roles. 1. Instrumental, task, leadership that emphasizes the completion of tasks by a social group. 2. Expressive, leadership that emphasizes the collective well-being of a social group's members. 3. Instrumental leaders tend to have secondary ties to group members. Expressive leaders tend to have more primary ties. 4. Example of traditional family as having instrumental leader, father, and expressive leader, mother. D. Another category of leadership types by extent of involvement of group members in decision-making. 1. Authoritarian, makes all decisions. 2. Democratic, more expressive, include group members in decision process. 3. Laissez-faire, minimize leadership position and let group operate on its own, least effective type of leadership. Sociometry. 6. Networks defined as A. Social ties that link people without the intensity of social interaction and common identity of a social group. B. Contrast to groups described by Granovetter as clusters of weak ties. Circa networks provide important res.